In the long history of the American anti-slavery movement, there were many courageous black activists. Before these well-known historical figures, there had been an unsung pioneer, David Walker. He was buried in an unmarked grave in this cemetery in South Boston.
He should be as well known as Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass or W.E.B. Du Bois.
He's a remarkable man. He should be a significant figure in our history, yet very few people know of him.
He was too dangerous. He was a badass.
In February 1820, 88 free black men, formerly slaves, were sent to Sherbro Island off the coast of the West African nation of Sierra Leone. For the next century, thousands of free men were taken from the United States and sent to this region. The American Colonization Society maintained this emigration policy because they believed that African Americans could only be fully free outside of America.
The principles behind that was that African Americans were physically less attractive, that they were sexually impulsive, that they were prone to lethargy, that they were undependable, and they were just vastly different than the white population.
Strategically, behind this, of course, was the idea that if you can get rid of all the free blacks, who are the potential troublemakers against slavery, you won't disturb slavery. You can keep slavery because you still have the enslaved, but they won't have any allies of black people who are free.
In 1829, David Walker, a free black man from Boston, wrote a pamphlet called Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. He spent a whole chapter in the appeal arguing that colonization was a pro-slavery conspiracy. Here is a demonstrative proof of a plan got up by a gang of slaveholders to select the free people of color from among the slaves, that our more miserable brethren may be the better, secured in ignorance and wretchedness, to work their farms and dig their mines, and thus go on enriching the Christians with their blood and groans. Long before the foundation of the American Colonization Society, President Thomas Jefferson had listed several reasons in the Notes on the State of Virginia for why blacks and whites would not be able to coexist peacefully.
Thomas Jefferson was locked into a sort of scientific rationale, because by the early 19th century, there was this scientific rationale explaining that African Americans, their cranial capacity, their physical makeup was such that they were inferior to the white race. And I think that Thomas Jefferson never really relinquished that.
In general, their existence appears to participate more of sensation than reflection. In memory, they are equal to the whites. In reason, much inferior. One could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid. Never yet could I find that a black had uttered a thought about the level of plain narration, never saw even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture.
What Walker does in the appeal is he pulls that argument apart step by step, and he really goes after Jefferson. To do that 3 years after his death, when Jefferson was still, this iconic figure in American society and in the culture, was a very daring thing to do, and of course made him more and more enemies.
See this, my brethren. Do you believe that this assertion is swallowed by millions of the whites? Do you know that Mr. Jefferson was one of the great characters as ever lived among the whites? See his writing for the world. I say that unless we try to refute Mr. Jefferson's arguments respecting us, we will only establish them. David Walker was born free to a free mother and a slave father in North Carolina. He traveled north and settled in Boston around 1825. Living on the north slope of Beacon Hill, he was quickly integrated into an established black community.
And that North Slope had folks who were already petitioning, folks who were already trying through a variety of protests and a variety of organizing to change the existing conditions for anyone who was African descent.
The North Slope has the oldest existing black church building in America, the African Meeting House. Built in 1806, the Meeting House was the chief cultural, educational, and political nexus of Boston's black community. The African School had been taking classes in a room on its first floor. The Massachusetts General Colored Association, which was the first abolitionist organization in Boston, met there. Well-known abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison, Maria Stewart, and Frederick Douglass all spoke at the Meeting House. The minister of the church, Thomas Paul, was a member of Prince Hall Freemasonry. Prince Hall Masonry was separated from the Massachusetts Grand Lodge and was dominated by blacks. In July 1826, Walker took a significant step into the heart of the black community by joining Prince Hall. The Grand Master John T. Hilton, who also lived in the North Slope, founded the Massachusetts General Colored Association with other Prince Hall Masons. Walker gave a vigorous speech in a meeting of the association in December 1828, calling for a national movement to abolish slavery. He and other association members helped to develop the first national black newspaper, Freedom's Journal. Before its first issue was released in New York on March 16, 1827, John T. Hilton, Thomas Paul, David Walker, and some other activists held a meeting at Walker's house to discuss how to assist the journal. Walker was also a salesman for the journal in Boston.
He, as an activist coming from outside, was welcomed. He had connections, stories, values, principles to share, and he was welcomed.
Then, in 1829, he presented his abolition values in his Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. The appeal was viewed as one of America's most provocative political documents of the 19th century.
He called for the immediate abolition of slavery, not a gradual dismantling of the slave system, but immediate.
You have to free up your own mind, free yourselves from mental slavery. That was first and foremost. He said you had to be self-reliant and free up your mind from this slavish mentality.
Walker made a living in Boston as a used clothing store owner. The copies of his appeal were distributed from his store to other parts of the nation.
Among his customers were sailors. He sewed copies of the appeal in the coats to black sailors, who then took them on board their ships, traveled down south, and then went ashore with these pamphlets still in the lining of their coats, distributed them to contacts who had their own underground networks.
An article from a Boston newspaper proved the impact of the appeal. We know that the larger portion of them have read it, or heard it read, and that they glory in its principles, as if it were a star in the east, guiding them to freedom and emancipation.
The value of the human property and slaves in the American South, even at the time of the Civil War, was greater than all the money from the merchants, from the banks, all the businesses in this country.
Remember that at this time, slavery was the economic bedrock of the country, both North and South. So the idea that you would immediately take away sort of the economic foundation, the foundation of the economy, essentially, people just couldn't even conceive of that as a possibility. It caused such a stir that authorities in a number of states, southern states, both increased penalties for any so-called seditious literature. They seized copies of the appeal where they could find them, and anybody who was caught with one was either sent deep into slavery in further south or went to jail. The perceived threat of Walker was so great that the governor of Georgia at one point put a price of $10,000 on Walker's head.
The bounty on his head made the black community believe he was murdered instead of dying of tuberculosis, as documented in Boston City records.
David Walker died under mysterious circumstances 2 years after this was published. It could be that he died of contagious flu. It could be that someone managed to figure out a way to get rid of him.
He died of consumption, tuberculosis officially.
Raising David Walker is a play set in 1979, during Boston's busing crisis. It tells the story of an African-American girl who is trying to find out if Walker had actually been assassinated.
And you're surprised by that? I mean, who wrote the city records? White people who kept the history. White people.
Serena? Hello? Are you there?
During her investigation, she encountered a lot of hatred and struggled for racial justice.
You want to dig up graves? You go back to fucking monkey land and cover yourself in fucking chicken blood. Whatever the fuck you do.
What I tried to do with the play was to give a sense of what kind of an inspirational figure Walker was and how he still does speak to us today when it comes to issues of racial justice. And our last performance on Sunday, officially we were only meant to have 99 seats, and we had 150 people in the audience.
Community Change is a Boston-based nonprofit for racial justice. Raising David Walker is one of the events used to educate the public about his life and works. The group is also considering building a physical memorial for him.
It's a wonderful opportunity in talking about abolitionists to talk about that whole community over there on the North Slope. Several years with Peter Hinks back in the early 2000s, and I found that he and I had stood there one day and said, this would be a place for a plaque about David Walker. And so that's what started the whole thing.
We've created the website, the David Walker Memorial Project, which has a lot of information about Walker and a lot of resources. We've done a number of events around Walker, and we're continuing to work with the hopes down the road of, as I said, of creating a memorial. We might expect some conferences and forums on Walker. We're hopeful to have at least a plaque at the cemetery where he is, where we believe he's buried.
I'm very interested in seeing if we can get the Boston Parks Department, which owns the historic cemeteries in Boston, to put an appropriate marker at the cemetery in South Boston where David Walker was buried. When you talk to most people, most Americans about the end of slavery, they think of the abolitionists, and most of the abolitionists they think were white. And most of the abolitionists were probably people of color.
Question authority, question what you're learning. This is not just a story of African Americans, it's a story of every situation where you have caste-like conditions, where you have some with more power than others, some category of people that's in and others that are out. We all need to tell these stories of how change has occurred.
There are some people in history who just will not let a wrong and a lie stand, no matter what the cost is to them personally. And David Walker is one of those people. We need more David Walkers. We need more people to stand up and say no.